I'm often asked, what would I say is the ideal human diet? Well, I think you can see evidence of ideal diets around the world in traditional eating systems. We often point the finger at the Mediterranean diet, and I think the Mediterranean diet, in terms of its overall composition, is a good example of what would be a diet where humans truly do thrive. Most of the diets around the world where people appear to have exceptional longevity and freedom from chronic disease later in life, those diets reflect on a pattern of eating very similar to the Mediterranean diet. In fact, a couple of the blue zones are Mediterranean places. The Icarus Island and Sardinia, for instance, are Mediterranean regions, and that's really where you'd say traditionally the Mediterranean diet would be what they ate and what they often still eat in more rural areas. As far as the ideal diet goes, how would you say, where would people go to find information about this? I'm going to say something that'll probably right away people are going to turn this video off and go to another channel. But hear me out here, and that is that the Canada Food Guide is probably a really good place to start. And if you would have asked me that question 10 years ago, I never would have said something like that, because I always hated the Canada Food Guide. I called it the Canada Food Industry Guide, which it really was. It was really a guidance to Canadians to teach in schools and in healthcare settings and in the teaching of dietitians what would be the best way for people to learn how to eat. It was the Canada Food Guide. Well, it was informed largely by the food industry, or at least they had a huge part to play in what that diet was about. And essentially the foundation of that diet was a lot of processed food, as you might say. That's what it boiled down to. And a lot of processed carbohydrates, particularly. It was more or less a diet that said, eat a little less fat and eat a lot of carbohydrates, and dairy products were a food group. Nothing against dairy products, but why were they a food group? It's not necessarily something you have to have in your diet. So the good news is that at some point in time, a few years ago, there was a health minister, Jane Philpott. She's one of my heroes in terms of what you can see democracy actually do once in a while. Because at one point in time, the health minister said we need a new Canada Food Guide, and there was a time where Health Canada went across the country and talked to stakeholders, people that wanted to have some input on the new Canada Food Guide. And I was one of those stakeholders. I was in the nutrition faculty, the Food Nutrition Health program at UBC. I was there as an adjunct professor for a few years, and I attended all those meetings, and I was a pretty loudmouth there. And I said, number one, the food industry shouldn't have a part of this. We need to confine the new Canada Food Guide to people who are studying nutrition and who are working in the clinical practice of nutrition, which I was and still am. And the good news is she listened, and we had time to put input into the new Canada Food Guide. And lo and behold, the Canada Food Guide that's out there that nobody looks at really, that should be the foundation for a lot of teaching and learning, it's being ignored for the most part. It is a really, really good food guide. And it's just, I guess it's not sexy enough. There's no clickbait on it, so people don't really hear about it much. But it's a very important document, and it's a very important foundation for good nutrition, and you ought to go look at it. You can find it very easily. Just Google the Canada Food Guide. And the thing is that it reflects a lot of what we've been teaching in the clinical practice of preventive medicine and nutritional practice in obesity medicine. And it really revolves around a concept which is, we call it the healthy plate. So what you have is an ideal diet should be composed of essentially the right proportions of the right kind of food. And the thing that's interesting in the Canada Food Guide is it's really revolving around real food. It says right out that you shouldn't eat processed food that much, especially when it comes to things like processed carbohydrates. In terms of carbohydrates, they should be made of real food, things like yams and sweet potatoes and potatoes, real potatoes. They're not necessarily French fries, but things like boiled potatoes and ways of making potatoes that don't have a lot of gooey stuff all over them. And starchy vegetables like squash and whole grains, truly whole grains. And so that composes a small proportion of the plate, about a quarter of the plate, and then about a quarter of the plate should be healthy proteins. So mostly lean meats, fish, things like tofu, dairy products, especially fermented dairy products, lower fat dairy products. That's a quarter of your plate. And then the rest of the plate should be volumetric foods made of vegetables and some fruits. And you can cover the plate with that if you want. You can eat an extra serving of that if you want. So that's the good news, is it's a diet that is in keeping with something that we call the volumetric way of eating. If you want to know, what's the magic diet or the obesity code when it comes to obesity management, it isn't necessarily a diet filled with all sorts of rules and regulations and restrictions. It's a diet that's abundant in things that fill your stomach without filling you with calories. It's a concept that revolves around something we call calorie density, and that is that, for instance, if you take a typical lunch or something that people would order on BC ferries, it's usually burger and fries, maybe some poutine or something like that. It's a meal that has very small volume, might be a couple cupfuls of volume, but it's just loaded with calories, probably 2 or 3 times the amount of calories than you need actually in that meal. That's not a volumetric meal. That's just the opposite. And that's the big problem with the diet that people eat today. It's not like the Canada Food Guide, which is a volumetric way of eating, where the plate is mostly foods that fill your stomach with very little calories involved, and then have small amounts of the higher calorie foods, like maybe the meat or the fish or the eggs or the chicken or the tofu, that sort of thing, and with some fat and so on, healthy fats, particularly things like olive oils and maybe some fatty fish and some saturated fats. And then the starches are from whole grains and from truly low glycemic index carbohydrates in a small proportion. And using that principle of the healthy plate, it also applies to a healthy bowl. For instance, oftentimes people will go to a food court and maybe order a stir fry and understand that for the sake of their budget, they will pile the rice onto this giant mountain, and then they'll put a little bit of meat and a little bit of vegetables, and then they'll pour the sugary teriyaki sauce on the top, and then guess what? What you got is not a very healthy meal. But if you were to compose that a little bit differently, ideally, if you can get a place where they'll give you a bit of brown rice and maybe a much smaller portion. Remember that Canada Food Guide healthy plate idea? It's about a quarter of the plate and a lower glycemic carb, particularly. If it's going to be white rice, make it a little bit smaller and then it's fine. But the idea is you want to pile those vegetables on high. When I go to the food court and I want to stir fry, I say either no rice, because it's hard to say less rice. I'll say often no rice. Maybe that'll be a low carb meal for me, and I'll pay for extra vegetables, so then it becomes more of a volumetric meal. And maybe I'll pay for some extra protein if I know they're not giving me that much protein. And then you can have something that gives you that enjoyment. It gives you that feeling of fullness, but you're not overloading your belly with way too many calories. Because when you go to a restaurant, typically they're going to serve you twice as much food as you really need. And the good news is that if you go out to eat at a restaurant, go ahead and eat at the restaurant and look down at your plate and realize if they've served you twice as much food, you just had a 2-for-1 special. They gave you a 2-for-1 special because you can take half of that home and eat it for the meal the next day. When I say to people, what's the healthiest diet? What's the ideal diet? Probably start with the simple things. It's not going to be good clickbait, but it's really the fundamental teaching that the majority of us teach when it comes to healthy nutrition. It revolves around that simple idea. And the Canada Food Guide is a pretty good starting point. And I'm kind of amazed at myself for saying that, for promoting the Canada Food Guide, but I really wish there was a way to get it out there more. The good news is that dietitians are coming out now well-versed in the new Canada Food Guide, and it's good now, because back in the day when I hired dietitians, I worked for many years with dietitians, probably over 20 years in clinical practice, and the first thing I'd have to do when I hired a dietitian is spend a couple years kind of deprogramming them from the Canada Food Industry Guide, because that's what it was. Now I just say, let's talk about the Canada Food Guide, because it's a pretty good food guide. So there you go. Not clickbait, but it's it's really got a lot of traction